be recording this portion of the meeting. Thank you.
Now I can be fact checked, which is nerve-wracking, because I just make all this stuff up. I'm kidding. So listen, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I think, you know, the sort of broad whack at all this is that I think a lot of what's happening in the world is incredibly overwhelming. And I think that it's very easy to look at what's happening in Southern California, in the Southwest, or actually all over the world, and feel like you have no agency, that you have skin in the game, but no way to actually do anything about it. And that's just profoundly untrue. And so, you know, what I have found is that you can have a powerful, powerful impact on the state of the planet and much of the crises that are facing us just by dealing directly with the world outside your front door. So that's what I'm going to talk about, is sort of what got me into all this, what I learned, and the ways that I think it can make a radical difference in the fate of our planet by looking at trying to crack open all of our heads about how this can be scalable and adaptable and apply to everyone. There's a lot of barriers to entry in gardening, and it tends to live in the lifestyle section of newspapers. And that's a horrible place for it to be, because done correctly, it addresses a lot of the issues facing us. So I keep this quote on top of all my Wild Yards projects on my website. I keep it everywhere because Thomas Rainier is a new perennialist. And while I don't agree with the plants he might choose, the sentiment is, I think, spot on. And the next renaissance of human culture will be the reconstruction of our natural world in our cities. Plants will be at the center of it all. Retrofitting biodiversity into urban and suburban settings is a powerful, powerful way to alter the course of our own history, and we all have agency within that. So I love that idea. So when I was a kid growing up in New Jersey, I grew up in the post-World War II boom of all the ranch houses, tract houses going up everywhere. And you'd have mile after mile after mile after mile of tract homes. And then you'd have a hurricane fence, and you'd have an old overgrown farm, tertiary, secondary forests. And in those forests, if you ran and you jumped over that fence, you'd suddenly be in a relatively wild world. Old farms been reclaimed by oak, maple, and elm, deciduous forests, still plenty of wildlife to be found. It's where I spent most of my childhood, under the dense canopy, hunting for wild things like this male eastern box turtle, which was my holy grail of reptiles. I loved finding box turtles. But we had marble salamanders, tiger salamanders, pickerel frogs, tree frogs, little brown bats, deer, all, you know, an amazing diversity of birds. Right there next to this dense cheek to jowl development. So that created my baseline sort of expectation for wildness. And of course, a kid growing up in that same neighborhood now, it's just tract homes. That's all gone. But in me lives that baseline understanding of nature. Many decades later, moved to Los Angeles, go through a whole career in various sides of the camera and film and television. I meet my wife, and this happens. Right there, that's not beer. And in a rush to house our upcoming child, we buy a house, Northeast Los Angeles. I love the curb appeal of this flipper grass, always a big sell right there. And we live in Northeast LA. This is where our house is. Now, it's interesting to note that this is considered a heavily wooded city compared to the rest of Los Angeles. But that's your tree canopy. And along come these two. And as we were sort of moving into having kids, I became obsessed with how our kids were going to have empathy for the natural world. You know, we live in the embrace of one of the most unique ecosystems in the world, and I'll get into that. But they live, you know, back here. And this isn't a wildly biodiverse place. Most of that tree canopy is exotic, and we'll talk about why that's an issue. Along come these two, and the first question I have is, what about my kids' box turtles? What about their experience of the wild world? And granted, I'm lucky enough to have a backyard, but what we're talking about here is about the plants that create biodiversity and those that don't, and who gets access to that and why. In short, what are the wild for most people living in an urban area? So the first thing we did is we started a pollinator garden. And I seem to badmouth pollinator gardens a lot in this talk, and I'm not. But I want to adjust your view to the difference between what can be conceived or perceived as a pollinator garden and what's actually habitat. They're two completely different things. So I did have a pollinator garden, and it was pretty exciting. And we had tropical milkweed, and we raised monarchs on that and some other things. And so I felt good that my kids were having an interaction with the natural world. But after a while, with my education I began to wonder about bees. All I saw were honeybees, European honeybees coming through. And I became aware that the wildlife in our yard was actually quite limited. And I learned, for instance, that there are about 160 native bees that are endemic to Los Angeles, but I was only seeing a few. And so this sent me down a rabbit hole. Why wasn't I having a greater diversity of wildlife in my yard? I had so many plants. So I began to study the work of a bunch of different people. Years ago, I read a seminal essay by David Quammen. He's one of the greatest science and naturalist writers alive, in my opinion. And in 1998, he published an article in Harper's Magazine called Planet of Weeds. And this is it's a piece on his revelations about the rampant invasion of exotic species and their inevitable impact on our indigenous ecosystems. It made a huge impression on me, and it, of course, has been incredibly prophetic in a very short period of time. I then learned about the National Wildlife Habitat Certification Program, first of its kind in the United States, and food, water, cover, places to raise young, a really powerful sort of standard for what creates habitat. Then a few years back, I was turned on to the work of Doug Talmay. If you know him, he's ubiquitous. You know what he does. If you don't, Doug was the first scientist to be able to crunch the data and prove the relationship between, sorry, I'm going to move this. The relationship between native plants and insects, and the coevolution of those species, and how insects become specialized feeders on certain plants, and why that matters. And Carol Bornstein, who wrote many of the seminal and still the best books on native plants in California horticulture. So that was sort of my group. These people shape my thoughts. And I'll get into Doug's work, and I'll get into how this relates to how we can move forward. So a guy named Dr. Michael Rosenzweig in 2002 came up with he coined the term reconciliation ecology. Reconciliation ecology begins at home. Reconciliation ecology is the science of inventing, establishing, and maintaining new habitats to conserve species diversity in places where people live, work, and play. And the kind of big punch upside the head was that this is essential. This is essential to the maintenance of biodiversity in the United States, because there's only about 4% uncorrupted wild space left in the US based on his study. The other 96% has been disturbed or lost to cities, suburbs, farmland, timber, and grazing. So I think for most of us, certainly for me, growing up in the suburbs and as a kid who loved going out to the Sierras and the Tetons and all these places, for me, nature was out there and I lived in a suburb. These things were wholly separate. And what Rosenzweig very clearly said, and what a lot of spiritual, this is not a new idea, but as above, so below. The world writ large is written in the smallest thing within us. And this notion of reconciliation ecology states that this 40 million acres of suburban lawns and things like that is essential to saving the species on our planet. And so to retrofit that space is our goal. So 90% of all leaf-eating insects rely on native plants for food. Leaves are, tender and soft, and so they produce a chemistry to repel insects. It takes insects millennia to figure out how to break down those leaves, right? So when you take those out of the ecosystem and replace those with non-native species, the insects don't have time to figure that out. and they lose their food source. And that whole protein, that vast amount of protein leaves the ecosystem. And why that matters is, here's a piece by Doug Talmay. An average pair of nesting birds consumes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars per clutch. And some birds breed 3 times a year. So you do the math, that's a lot of caterpillars. But if you remove the trees that those caterpillars feed on, you don't have that food source. So you lose your insect proteins, they go away, and then you lose all those birds. Birds are sort of a highly charismatic and recordable animal, right? Birding is a huge, huge business, huge hobby. But you have to know that with those birds go thousands and thousands of other species as well. So this relationship, the coevolution of plants and insects, and the amount of, and the base of the pyramid of proteins that serves, is everything when it comes to biodiversity and habitat. So now we know, in a study by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, 3 billion birds lost since 1970. We also know from a study published in the Biological Conservation Journal of April 2019 that 40% of all insects globally in decline. Now, why is this? Largely, it's due to habitat loss. Other things, global warming plays a role in that. That's it's a tricky number to sort of gauge, but obviously the big thing is habitat decline and all of these things that we're talking about. And what has come in its place is largely the American lawn. I think a lot of you are probably aware of these numbers, but again, I'm just going to lay this all out. There are 40 million acres of lawns in the US and more every day. Lawns consume up to 10 billion gallons of fresh water daily. They use 80 million pounds of pesticides a year, 90 million pounds of chemical fertilizers. They're responsible for 5% of our carbon emissions. That comes from lawnmowers and leaf blowers. And a nice piece of data that UC Davis found out was here in Southern California, the average American child uses their lawn, an aggregate total, 40 minutes a week, and adults use it about 10 minutes. And of that, they figured that they used about 20% of that lawn. But even if you don't have a lawn, you still have steps, you still have a driveway, you still have access to places to create habitat, you still have community centers, you still have medians. There's tons of opportunity to retrofit habitat. So let's not get hung up on lawns, but it's the use of our open space is really what this conversation is about. And if you look at the use of our open space, the same problem almost always applies. So when you think about revitalizing your ecosystem, the first thing you got to figure out is, well, if I want to reintroduce things into my wherever, into my median, my parkway, into my yard, you first have to understand where you live. And here we live in coastal sage scrub. That's our true home. And what's interesting about that, which just kind of a nice aside, is that ours is a biodiversity hotspot. The California chaparral coastal sage scrub is a biodiversity hotspot. And a hotspot is a region that has 2 criteria. It must contain at least 1,500 species of vascular and vascular plants as endemic, only from here. And it has to have lost at least 75% of its primary vegetation. That's here. So some of these hotspots support up to 15,000 endemic plant species and have lost up to 95% of their natural habitat. California is ranked as first in the United States in mammal diversity, 4th in bird diversity, and 5th in reptile diversity. It's also one of the top ranking states for the number of animal species at risk. And many of these species are found right here in our chaparral. 40% of our, sorry, I'm moving this up here. That 40% of our plants are endemic. So we live in a gem. If you look at the shared taxonomy, this magenta, these are all states, these are all regions that share a great deal of their biodiversity. And you get the green and the yellow, you see it gets narrower. And then you get out to California and we have a little blue and a little purple. And that gives you a sense of how isolated we are, how rare a gem we are in possession of and surrounded by. So just a little incentive. This talk would apply. I would give the same talk anywhere in the world, but for us, we're in a particularly fortunate and imperiled spot. So what we do here matters that much more. Islands are where species go to die. This is David Quammen, and he was talking literally about islands, but the same applies for islands of wildness. You've got the San Gabriels, you've got the Verdugos, you've got Griffith Park here, you've got Mount Washington, which is still heavily developed, but it's a little greener. And then it's all surrounded by these vast seas of urban and suburban development. And the reason that Quammen said the islands are where species go to die is because this is fragmentation. Species declines in the US fall squarely at the feet of habitat loss, cutting up the breeding and feeding grounds of species, no matter how large they might seem to us, is a surefire way to terminate the species for good. In other words, people can go like, well, we have, we got the San Gabriels right over there. We got the San Bernardinos. They're still surrounded by vast seas of humanity. And so even our charismatic megafauna, like our, P22 that's stuck over here in Griffith Park, obviously they're heavily imperiled because they can't breed in times of, over time, lowered populations. They can't survive the downturns and disasters like fires and drought and all those things. They will doom all these species to failure if they can't move about, find food, water, and mates. And we all know about the mountain lions of Southern California, but even a one that's more charismatic and, goes on kind of monthly right up the street here, bear and Eagle Rock. And we have a lot of bears that get stuck and they come down here. They either come down the Arroyo Seco or they come down right here by Fig. And, they're looking for food. It's dry up there. We've had a big drought. We've had a lot of fires. And they get stuck under the 134 right here, and they got no place to go. So they kind of wander along Hill Street, wander around here, come down in here, knock over a few garbage cans, scare a few cats, dive into someone's pool right around here. And then they can get back under the freeway up here, and they go up into the foothills right here. And then they jump onto Chevy Chase, and then they go bug people in Glendale. But fragmentation impacts everything, not just our big charismatic species. The average flight range of our native bees, it varies, but they lack the range of our non-native honeybees, even though our native bees do a solid, let's conservatively say 50% of the pollinating of our big ag, and the lion's share of our pollinating here in our native ecosystems and in our yards. So the traditional garden doesn't allow for native bee habitat, and the wild spaces are simply too far apart to support these bees. Our native bees, they can't fly as far as honeybees. Honeybees can fly up to 6 miles, but a lot of our native bees, the little sweat bees, leafcutter bees, again, and remember, these are bees that do the same amount of pollinating. Some of them can only fly 300 feet. And if these yards are impenetrable, if they're covered in things that can't be used, like concrete or grass and all those things, you've lost that habitat. So we are wiping out our native pollinators. And so by invoking these habitat practices that we're going to talk about, we start to truly create habitat. It's not just about having pollinator plants and flowers as nectar. It's about the habitat that allows a great diversity of things to live in. And I can go back and visit this if you'd like. And I'm going to stop real quick just to make sure, how is this all tracking for everybody? Is just sort of what I'm saying flowing, or am I moving too fast?
It's good.
Okay, good. All right, good.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
All right.
So we're going to learn how to invoke the habitat.
We are.
Good.
So this is my first native plant, and this was my first native bee. This is Cleveland sage at 2 years old, and this was being visited by this is the first time the bee appeared. This is my favorite photograph of it. And this is a longhorn summer bee. Summer bees are digger bees. They live in solitary holes in the ground, and they need to be able to get to that ground. So they open earth, can't be covered in concrete, obviously, can't be covered in mulch, all those things. But the arrival of this bee and many other bees, butterflies, and wasps was my clue that I was onto something with the plants I was choosing and the way I was tending my garden. So these visitors had a deeper connection to and need for the plants I was planting. And what I also learned is that these native bees are painfully undervalued in our agricultural systems. The United States Geological Site says that almost all crops, native bees are the primary pollinator, or they significantly supplement the activity of honeybees. And some of our native bees are the specialists on the very plants that we use for food, including squash, pumpkins, gourds, sunflowers, etc. So the big thing is understanding that a pollinator garden should be endemic, and it should supply not just the nectar from the flower, but the ground within which they can live. And we'll get into all that. So this is my front yard now. As we can see, it's a big change from that. And this is, and I will admit that I am guilty of overplanting. I've always been a little bit of a collector. But one of the reasons I did it is also because the greater plant diversity, the greater biodiversity. All these plants are endemic to Southern California. And I use it as a kind of laboratory because back here, I get no sun back here. So this functions as kind of an oak woodland underneath these junipers, which provide a lot of acid. And then as we get out here, this is a full sun area. So this is almost a kind of high desert, Antelope Valley sort of situation. But the wildlife that I've been able to record in this area, I'll just throw out a super quick list. Towhees, wrens, hummingbirds, bush tits, digger bees, leafcutter bees, carpenter bees, bumblebees, alligator lizards, western fence lizard, bush katydid, shorthorn grasshopper, mourning cloak butterfly, skippers, painted ladies, hair streak butterflies, monarchs, and a peacock, which has nothing to do with anything. I have no idea, but it lived there for a while and it was weird. This is my backyard. True confession, this was a California native fescue lawn that I attempted last year and it failed, it's dead. Everything else is alive, but the lawn croaked. Happy to talk about grass with anybody who wants to pull their hair out. The only thing harder than a border collie mix is this lawn. And the short list of visitors.
Why did you go with that lawn actually when you wanted to try to get the bees that need dirt?
I have plenty of dirt. I have I have lots of reserved areas for them. They live down in here. I have this all back. I was interested in a fescue because I'm very interested in soil health and trying to fight soil impaction and things like that. And because these are 3 California fescues, they would have the microbiology that was really complementary to all my California native plants. And grass, when you leave it very long, sequesters an enormous amount of carbon. And unlike a tree, that carbon goes into the ground. When a tree falls, all that carbon goes back up into the atmosphere. So I love grasses, and I strongly recommend people use them, our bunch grasses, wherever and whenever possible. So it was an experiment and it failed. But so my borders have lived. I have borders of fescue, and then in the middle, I'm going to do something else, probably yarrow and flagstone. But again, there's a long laundry list of animals, that same one that I just said, plus many, many more. Come back here. And instead of reading you that list, what I'll do is I'll talk about the animals that have come to my yard and why they've come to my yard and what that says about habitat. So pollinator gardens are to habitat gardens as a froyo shop is to a village. This pisses a lot of people off, and it's not necessarily true, but I like to say it because it pisses people off. But if you go to Armstrong, if you go to Home Depot, if you go to Lowe's, they're going to sell you pollinator plants. And if you use those pollinator plants in a very traditional way, and you blow out all the leaf litter from underneath them, and you don't create low, medium, and high layers for things to nest in and perch in and to seek shelter and feed under, then you will get a lot of butterflies, and you'll get some bees coming in for those nectars. They will pollinate those flowers. But you won't have the caterpillars that need those plants to survive. You won't have then, therefore, that layer of proteins that all the birds survive on. And you're not really going to have habitat. You're just going to have a pollinator garden. That having been said, you can use native plants and other plants to create habitat that can be sort of described as a pollinator garden. So just a few stories. For example, one thing that drove home for me the success of what was happening in our backyard is this is a young red-shouldered hawk. And I came home one day and I was hanging out with my camera, and this hawk landed on that stick. It's an old plum tree that I cut down that didn't survive. And I use a lot of like snags and things, and I throw those around for things to climb on and perch on and get a little point of view. And I came home, he's on that, or she, and I thought it was weird to see a hawk 18 inches off the ground, kind of looking around. And then it jumped down into here and started scratching like a chicken, and all through the leaf litter. And then it would go down and it would bite something like a chicken, which I just thought, I thought something was wrong with either me or it. And I filmed it and I sent it to my friend Scott Logan, who runs Wild Wings Ecology. He's the lead naturalist over at Gottlieb Native Garden. And he said, yeah, it can't find food. It's learning to hunt and it's failing. So what it's looking for is proteins in your leaf litter. So it's eating worms. It's eating worms and bugs and beetles and anything it could to stay alive. And what you may know, and I didn't know, is that 80% of all hawks die in their first year. They never learn to hunt. They don't find enough food. Hunting for food is extremely hard. It's why most of our ancestors, we like to think they were running around with a spear killing mastodons, but they weren't. They were eating grubs and they were tending the wild and they were working the plants and things like that. So watching this hawk then come and basically wean itself on the garden, both by hunting, but also by living off the proteins that were living in the leaf litter, was a huge indicator to me that I was doing something right. Having water, clean running water at all times in your garden is essential to actually having habitat. This is a yellow-rumped warbler, and it's a migratory species. It comes in the late spring through early summer. All the warblers do. There's several. I get about 5 species in my yard every year now. And this is a little sweat bee, and this is on Eriogonum, the red buckwheat. And I get a lot of sweat bees, which means they're finding places to. I think sweat bees, forgive me, they're either they live in holes in the wood or they live in holes in the ground. I sometimes get them confused with the other leaf cutters, but they're finding habitat, and they're finding habitat fairly close, and they're also finding plants that they like to pollinate. So again, plant diversity amplifies biodiversity. The more local your plants are, the more you're going to attract those insects and animals that evolved in that area. And this is, of course, a morning cloak butterfly on tansy leaf phacelia, which is one of its favorite plants. So I love that. I like those stories. And it's very important to understand that even though I've converted a lot of my property into habitat, that our yard is still a place for our kids. It's a place to have parties. It's a place to have friends. It's a place to do work and to have quiet time. It's not, it's for everybody. And those two things, human wants and animal needs, can very comfortably coexist. So this is Coop. Coop is a young Cooper's hawk that also trained in our yard and kept failing and failing. And then one day we came home. I had the picture and I took it out. And my kids came running into the house and they were like, Dad, there's something on the walkway. And they ran to the end of the driveway, and it was a head. It was just a little head. It was a rat head. And I looked up and there was Coop up in the tree eating the rest of the rat. And so, if you give them a training ground, they'll help you out. These are bush tits, which usually come through in a big flock. In my property, they always come through on the northeast corner of the property. They land in the big toyon tree that I have, and then they slowly work their way out to the front. But bush tits aren't here for the flowers. They're here for the little insects that feed on the new growth. And they'll come through in a cloud and they'll clean it of all its pests. So it's a very symbiotic thing. And this is the alligator lizard out on my parking strip, which right now is dormant, but every spring, Clarkia unguiculata and Clarkia amoena, farewell to spring, grow all the way on the parking strip. And then all the lizards come out from under the house or wherever they're hanging out, and they live in that area and they take advantage of the insects that come to these flowers. This is, again, longhorn summer bees. And the first time I saw this, I had no idea what I was looking at. And what I learned is the males aren't really welcome at home. They're not useful in these, like I said, these guys live in holes in the ground. So they'll go out and they'll pollinate, they'll cruise around. And then as the sun comes down and gets cold, they clamp their mandibles onto the stem right there. And they just go to sleep and they hang out until the sun comes up. And if you ever see it, a cool thing to do, get up before sunrise and wait and watch as the sun hits it. And they'll slowly sort of wake up. But if you're into macro photography like I am, it's a great time to get amazing pictures of these very important native bees. And these are very, very specialized. They really love the native flowers, and you won't find them on most of the things that you would normally use in a drought tolerant garden that are from Europe, Australia, South America. They're very specialized. So thinking about biodiversity and trying to quantify, put all this data together, the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles had a BioScan biodiversity project. It was the biggest one ever. It's the biggest urban biodiversity study that's ever been done. They studied 80 sites for a year. They collected 1,872 samples. They identified 500 plus species as of a year ago. I'm pretty sure they're way beyond that now. And 47 new species were discovered here in Los Angeles alone. So what I thought was interesting was talking to Lisa and Ben. One of the things that they told me was that the native / water appropriate yards had 30 to 50% more biodiversity than traditional high water gardens utilizing exotic plants. And that figure, remember, it only relates to flying insects. So when you add in the appeal of a habitat garden to the other insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals, as well as the beneficial impact on your soil ecosystems, the increased biodiversity is obviously profound. But why this matters, let's talk about it. So in 2015, BioScan announces a remarkable discovery: 30 new species of fly discovered in Los Angeles. This was first published in Zoo Taxa in 2015. The reason this is interesting is because these flies breed almost entirely in humus, in leaf litter, and in compost, rotting matter. And why that matters is, of course, because let's say you really like hummingbirds, so you put up, the sugar water for them. Well, that sugar water consists of 6% of a hummingbird's diet, and whether that's getting it from the flowers in your yard, the nectar, or whether it's getting it from those dispensers, the other 94% of a hummingbird's diet is flies. So again, that fundamental protein that thrives in the conditions of a habitat garden is what feeds these birds, not the flowers. I mean, yeah, the flower is fuel and they need it, but that is not what keeps them alive. Animals need proteins to survive. And while pollinator gardens and drought-tolerant gardens may look nice and may provide food for pollinators, they do not, in and of themselves, support biodiversity. So how are we doing? Everybody good? Yeah, okay. So when we think about habitat, you have to think a little differently than just plants. And I'm just going to directly quote Barbara Eisenstein. She wrote the book Wild Suburbia. She has a blog called Weeding Wild Suburbia. She's one of those knowledgeable people I know on creating habitat in Southern California plants, period. And she just said, we were having a conversation. I made her write it down and send it to me because I loved it. A garden comprised of only or even mostly native plants will provide little food or shelter for birds or insects if it's maintained using today's most common garden. Whoop, I got too excited. Garden practices. Removing leaf litter, woody debris, using blowers, applying herbicides and insecticides, and heavily pruning trees and shrubs destroy habitat, regardless of plant selection. These common gardening practices lead to a greater loss of biodiversity than plant provenance alone. So this is what we're driving at. When you're thinking about habitat, you have to think about everything from below the soil to the highest part of your canopy and everything in between. You're trying to create a series of transitions that support life. So let's talk about that. Let's unpack that, shall we? So gardening for biodiversity checklist, native plants, not strictly, by the way. I'm not like a purist, but you know, generally the more local, the better because of the way things evolve. So if you want to go with like, you know, 50% straight species from here and then do whatever, you'll get your lavender in there because you got to have your lavender or whatever, you know, do it. But think about how long it took for things to learn to be here and have some compassion for that. So native plants, plant for habitat, low, medium, and high. These provide transition and safety zones. They provide nesting. They provide, you know, room for forage. They provide, if you ever watch birds, your proximity to a bird will dictate how high it goes. So a lot of times if they're down here at the water, and by the way, nobody has a garden like this. This is amazing. This is the Gottlieb native garden. And I just use it because it helps me illustrate everything at once. I don't have a water element like that. I got a little bird bath. It works great. But medium, low, and high is key. This provides the transition areas for lizards and insects and birds of all different species. It gives them safety. It gives them places to nurse. It gives them places to perch. And it's essential. Clean water access is key. Clean running water, especially where we live, is essential. And then let's talk about the next things. Humus, overall soil health and carbon sequestration. So when you let your leaf litter lie there, and obviously if you have walkways or your driveway or whatever, if you have, you know, if you want paths through it, paths across the parking strip, all of those places can be tended to give humans like a place to land, of course. But underneath your plant canopy, you want to let your leaf litter drop and you want to leave it alone. Let it break down. Obviously, that creates a very powerful ecosystem of mycorrhizae and mycorrhizal and microbacteria and microfauna. This is an incredibly important part of your garden, is this layer and everything that's going on beneath it. And in terms of carbon sequestration, it's hard to beat. Long-term deep soil carbon storage comes about through the creation of humus. And that is a result of relationships between actively growing plants, fungi, soil microbes, and other critters in a matrix that includes mineral soil and organic matter. When you blow this off with leaves, you destroy humus. You kill off vital insects, nesting and living in the leaf litter, and you rob the soil of its capacity to sequester carbon. When you blow off your leaf litter, you kill your soil. It goes from being soil to merely being dirt. It can't take it. Also, this kind of leaf litter, your native bees can handle. When you do thick, heavy mulch, or when it gets too impacted and hard, it's useless to them. So water infiltration. This is actually a very finely ground mulch, which in a new garden, I'd say is fine. But when you let that leaf litter and compost sit, it will remain in situ. It creates a very absorbent, permeable layer of topsoil. And that does a powerful job of absorbing water, reducing runoff, and fighting erosion. And adding bioswales and the stuff that they've done here amplify that site's ability to sink water and keep it from leaving the site. But leaf litter alone, that creation of that humus between your plants, your fallen matter, and the soil beneath is a powerful sponge for water. And it's easy to see as you walk around. You'll notice places where people use weed barrier, like weed cloth and stuff like that, that completely compacts the soil, and it robs it of its ability to, one, create the bacterial culture that soil needs to be healthy, and to infiltrate water. This is all about maintenance practices, right? So tend lovingly and seasonally, no pesticides, no fertilizer, no leaf blowers, most smart and most seasonal. Sometimes, you have grasses, they like a haircut. But over time, a native habitat garden costs approximately 1/3 to 1/4 the cost of a traditional lawn. So human health and safety. This is actually Cherry Canyon. It's nobody's yard that I know of, but the same ideas apply. Studies now conclusively show that children who grew up in biodiverse ecosystems have less susceptibility to disease. And this is due to the microbial benefits supplied by a biodiverse setting. And this is from Microbial March 2019. I abbreviated it, now I'm suffering for that. Also, people who spend time in biodiversity have lower rates of anxiety and depression. And this came from Science Advances in the 24th of July. So there's also speculation, this is under peer review, that biodiverse green spice has a tendency to reduce crime. So that one you can sort of go, the other two are fully data driven. So moving habitat beyond our yards, the only way that this can work, in my opinion, is it has to be scalable and adaptable and available to everybody. So I want to just throw out a few things that sort of help crack open our head about how biodiversity can be introduced all over and in different ways. They're not yard dependent, and they're not constrained, in my opinion, in any way at all. It just takes imagination. Rooftop gardens, this is created by Alive Structures out of Brooklyn. I focus on this company because they work with the Fortune Society and Hope program to help build biodiverse ecosystems on rooftops in underserved neighborhoods throughout New York. I just think this is a very cool thing. There are issues with rooftop gardens. There's a lot of reverse engineering that has to occur. They're very resource heavy, but I think if you're in an area that is just all concrete, this becomes a very meaningful and beneficial thing to do. Food security. This is Duran Chavez. He's a renowned activist and urban gardener out of Virginia. Pictured here is his resiliency gardens. Native plants are essential for successful food gardens and farms. Native plants for soil health, pollinator habitat, and overall biodiversity is a good thing. And this is a piece he did at the Contemporary Art Museum in Richmond. These are all urban beds, urban veggie beds surrounded by different native gardens to amplify the biodiversity of that site. Here in Southern California, people get a little worried about having edibles and natives combined, because obviously edibles tend to need a lot more water than your native plants. But that's easy to design. You can design for edibles and natives, and UC Davis did a study. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But when you surround your edible gardens with native pollinator plants, you amplify your yield significantly. And that's because native plants will bring in a greater diversity of bees. And so when you bring in those different bees, the sweat bees, the leafcutter bees, the digger bees, the bumblebees, you're hitting more parts of the flower, right? You're pollinating more parts of the flower, so you tend to get a better yield. So edibles and natives work together beautifully. You just have to design it a little more thoughtfully. This is Janet Valenzuela. She's a community organizer for the Eastside Communities for Environmental Justice. And I talked to her about why she thought native plants really mattered. This is an organization that supports communities on the 710 corridor, which you may or may not know is plagued with all kinds of Superfund sites and pollution. And these are highly impacted and marginalized communities. And what they do is they create decentralized gardens. So different homes volunteer to grow different things. And they use native plants in low-income neighborhoods as a practical way to connect people to the outdoors and to plants that once thrived in abundance. Having native gardens, green space, and sacred spaces that liberate us from harm, environmental threats, which they do because they remediate the soil, have a significant way of empowering community residents in a built environment. It allows for radical imagination for them to see what our environments can look like beyond industry and beyond environmental degradation. So other ways that native plants can be employed, this is Marshall Villas. This is an HOA. This was the site, a garden installed by Theodore Payne. This garden is now a year old. And it's so successful that another HOA down the block has now requested it. All HOAs should be using these. They're far less resource intensive. And, to me, it's just a win-win. I do realtor workshops. I teach realtors how to think differently about how they flip a property and what they put down there in the first place to create a more beneficial environment for biodiversity, for sequestering carbon, and for infiltrating water. This is one I love. And this is creating habitat where no dirt exists at all. This is a test site, but this was moved into a courtyard in Brooklyn. This is Anna Gerchik, and she creates a thing called BirdLink. She builds upon current work designed for ecological challenges to maintain biodiversity. And the strategy is to build a landscape network that collects isolated habitat across scales to make across isolated habitat. Again, fragmentation. So if you have big cities where there's just no habitat, these modular systems that are planted with native plants and have their own hydration system can be used to create those little connective tissue between habitats. In any setting, whether inner city or campus landscape, BirdLink channels the universal popularity of birds to interest people in habitat conservation and creation, and offers an answer to what can I do? And this whole talk is about what can I do? And I love this because this is a huge success of imagination, a huge feat of imagination. And I want to get her to do one out here. So China. It pains me to say that China is so far ahead of us in creating habitat and creating habitat standards. They have tariffs now that are lobbied against organizations that don't support habitat. They have sponge cities that are used for infiltrating water using native plants. They have Lizhou Forest City, which is created by Stefano Bori architects. And that is basically inviting the native ecosystems into the structure. Why not us? So when we plant for habitat, those islands start to go away, and we create tiny, smaller islands that undo fragmentation and allow different species to move more nimbly and to survive the impact of urban and suburban development. Then you have, for your little bees that can only fly 300 feet, there's plenty of terrain for them to breed in, and then go out and pollinate our gardens and our big ag and all of those things. You're also creating habitat for migratory and resident birds. You're creating habitat for, hundreds of lizard and reptile species that live here. So our properties are habitat corridors waiting to happen. This is Chief Seattle. It's a very visited speech. Teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of earth. If men spit upon the ground, they spit upon themselves. This we know, the earth doesn't belong to man, man belongs to earth. This we know, all things are connected, like the blood that unites one's family. All things are connected. It's really that simple to me, but thinking about that connection and how it pertains to inviting back indigenous systems and giving them an opportunity to flourish in a new way. This isn't about going backwards. This is about moving forward with intention and inventing a new wildness. So if anyone's interested, what do? Inspiration, education, transformation. We do outreach, creating native habitat where people live, at private and at schools, consultation, helping people to understand the possibilities of their site, real estate, writing real estate for the 21st century, trying to get realtors on the right path. We create a guide for them with analogous plants that they can use that will actually amplify biodiversity and lower the cost of maintenance. And if anybody can help or knows people that can help, we have a lot of programs, initiatives that we're going to launch this fall, so we can use all the help we can get. And that is it. Whose yard is next? Is everyone asleep?
Wow, thank you very much, David. That's amazing. Such an inspirational presentation. We do have some comments and questions in the box, so I'll go ahead and read them to you.
Okay, I think I have to get out of this, right? I gotta stop my share to, yeah, there we go. Awesome.
Great. So our first comment is from Jennifer Campbell. And just a few minutes ago, you and I were having a little discussion about Walnut Canyon. Jennifer is on the subcommittee for Walnut Canyon. And we're working to save that 4-acre natural open space with many black walnut trees. And one of the things that we're envisioning for that is a space that can be restored as a native habitat unique to this area. So that's something that hopefully we could be in dialogue with you about that.
Yeah, is that someone, was that Jennifer? Jennifer, was that you who reached out to me the other day? Someone reached out to me.
Yes, that was me.
Yeah, okay. Hi, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, we'll sideline that conversation for right now. I have, but I'm very interested in this whole thing, and it really comes down to, you know, for me, like what time I really have, because I have 2 community gardens and I'm working on a bunch of school gardens. But the first thing I'd like to do is actually just come up and kind of take a look and see, you know, where y'all are at with it and what I mean, because I don't really understand the legal of it. And, you know, getting into city fights and fights with developers eats up more bandwidth than I possibly have. But in terms of, you know, trying to help come up with, you know, with people who frankly know better than I, because big site restoration, you know, when you want plants, you want those successional plants that are really good at just showing up and surviving on their own. I don't know what kind of water is available, but we should all go take a look at it. Like I would love for you guys to take me to look at it.
That'd be great.
It's been a while.
Yeah, I'd love for you to see it.
Cool. Yeah, I will absolutely come look at it and see if we can sort of at least try and bring more resources to it.
Great.
Wonderful. And, so Marge was asking in one of your photos, I think of the one of the native garden in Beverly Hills, there were some pictures of bird feeders.
Yeah.
And so Marge says, are those bird feeders, is it okay to supplement your native plants with bird feeders?
Sure. You know, people get like all kind of weird about this. Look, there is so little habitat left. You know, we're eating up the planet. And so, you know, when I see people flinch at bird feeders, it's important to maintain good practices with bird feeders, clean up after them, keep your feeders clean. There's all kinds of viruses that can be passed on. If you leave your feeders dirty, a lot of finches are really suffering from these viruses that are spread from feeders. But at the end of the day, like if you can, wildlife attracts wildlife and birds attract birds. So the majority of birds that come to my yard don't come to the feeders, but I have feeders. I have 2 different feeders. One's a flat tray for doves, and then I also put peanuts on for the jays, because jays are hilarious. Jays are the border collies of birds. So when, you know, if you have a habitat, then all these other migratory birds, all the wrens and you know, all these other birds that actually don't want your seeds, they see that bird activity and they go like, oh, what's going on? And they'll come down. So I get such an enormous amount of warblers and wrens and really cool birds that come through the site because I have feeders. And as far as I'm concerned, being a stop along the feeding route, you know, for lesser goldfinches or for house finches, is a small price to pay for bringing greater biodiversity into my yard. And so by all means, use feeders, clean up the litter from them routinely, wash the feeders. But, you know, because you can have a problem. They will attract rodents after a while. Some people who live kind of on the borders of wild areas, they don't care because they're like, well, the coyotes eat them, so I don't care. But if you live like I do, 10 feet from Colorado Boulevard, that's not a good thing. There's a lot of rats down here already because of all these, you know, restaurants and stuff. So I have to keep it clean. Same thing up at the Gottlieb Garden, they keep it clean. But yeah, use bird feeders. I recommend using really healthy, good seed. Again, I would go to Wild Wings Ecology online and order their seeds. That's run by Scott Logan and his wife, Bonnie, and they make really good product. Just use good practices if you employ feeders, but you'll see a greater amount of biodiversity in your yard because of them.
Okay, great. And next, Zazu says, I like the idea of keeping the leaf litter. I've always been told the plants make their own fertilizer, so I practice just tearing up all my deadheading and putting it
Awesome.
under the plant.
Yeah.
Is the fact that it may still be green an issue? Or are
No.
you supposed to just let things drop naturally?
No. Tend your plants. Plants like to be taken care of. They like to be interacted with. I think it's very important. I mean, wait. Let your plants, if they're seeding, if they're, a lot of birds like the dry seeds. And so I always wait long into the end of summer, early fall before I start cutting back my sages and my Indian mallow or any of those things. But cut them back. I cut them back early spring down to that lower bract. So that where it was going to make 2, now it'll make 4. So you get more compact and a more dense plant from those things. Then you let it grow out and bloom out and seed out. And then late summer, early fall, I cut them back again. And then I chop all that up and I throw it under the plant. So absolutely, don't worry about whether it's green or not. It'll break down. And what you're doing is you're helping it create its own kind of protected ecosystem. So that's right on to do.
Okay, great. She's also asked, do you have a source for native edible plants?
Interesting question. Like what? I mean, it's funny because I use a lot of my plants for, I use a lot of my plants to make teas and things like that. You can cook with them in terms like hummingbird sage and pitcher sage, all your sages, and obviously mugwort has tons of medicinal uses. Anything from herbs to tomatoes, but those aren't native. Those are, they could be heirloom, but they're not native, most of the herbs or anything like that, right?
True.
So, I mean, but having said all that, if you want to talk about offline, you can email me at wildyardsproject@gmail, and we can talk about how to work with edibles and natives. But I don't know of like, and that could just be a failure of mine. I'm not like a genius with edibles. I really focus on the plants that are mostly available to us in the chaparral, and I'm just learning about what you can do with them in a culinary sense.
Great. And Abby just put in a resource, Edible Natives. Check out Pascal Baudar's books. And there's some other good resources out there for
yeah. Oh, I like elderberries. And yeah.
Chris Nigers has some good books out too. And
yeah, but I mean, most of those plants are all plants that you would find at most of the better, native plant resources. Most of them aren't. I mean, unless they're really hard to propagate, or I mean, there's a bit of a schism right now. I mean, because there's the kind of like the top 20 kind of native plants that everybody uses that go to, and so maybe some of the edibles. But yeah, I didn't like elderberry and all of those things are very common in a native garden and function as edibles.
So Marge is asking, so the leaf litter, does it take the place of the mulch? And if it's already mulched and it lands on top of the mulch, will it kind of work its way down?
Yeah, I mean, I mulched when I started my garden. My garden is in many phases because of work that we've done. But sometimes when I first did my garden, I mulched all my beds and planted into them. I don't do it anymore. I haven't really remulched in years. I just let the leaf litter do it because that is just it's a much kinder, navigable environment for most of the native fauna. Mulch is generally something that sometimes you really need it, but over time, as you let that leaf litter drop, that'll take the place of it. And it does a much better job of creating a correct, mycorrhizal and microbiological environment. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Is this part recorded? Because I sound like a nut.
No, it's making a lot of sense. Melanie's asking, do you irrigate? What kind of irrigation do you use?
So when I first did this, I I put in irrigation and I have drip irrigation and I would never do it again. If I was going to put in an irrigation system, I would always top water. The reason is because whether you have mulch or you've got a nice layer of humus, if you have drip irrigation, that moisture gets trapped and you actually can create a very like a fungal and bad pathogens that get kind of like in that environment. But when you irrigate from above, that everything starts to break down evenly and correctly. But so I have drip irrigation just because it was, no one was really like resolved on that matter. I barely ever use it now. 7 years later, I almost never use my irrigation. If there's a giant smoking hot drought and I'm away, I will wait until it ends. If I know it's coming, I might do a soak over summer, say like over summer. I'll finish this thought and then I'll be very clear about something. With established plants, I will water like once a month during the wet season and maybe a couple times over the summer. Let's say that. And if I can't do it by hand, which I just do with an Assoc, typical like old school sprinkler, then I will run my irrigation. That would just be because I'm not here. But I barely use my irrigation now, except when I put new plants in the ground. And the big thing about natives is it's not frequently. They like to be watered deeply and very infrequently. That's what they're built for. You want to get that water to go down, 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 drive those roots down so that when it heats up, the upper canopy can go dormant and the plant keeps itself alive by reaching down in those moisture, deeper layers. A lot of people who try to like just move over from the traditional colonialist gardening techniques tend to water like a couple times a week for a few minutes, and what you have are these really shallow root systems and the plants just die come the first drought because they just cook. So I do irrigate in times of drought, and I do it infrequently and deeply. For new plants, anything that I just put in within the first year, I water it about every 7 to 10 days. And again, I water about 3 gallons for every 1 gallon pot.
Okay. Now, Michael's asking, he's wondering about leaf litter versus fire department letters. A lot of us live in the hillsides and we have fire department inspections in the spring, and they want us to have our yards free of flammable debris.
Yeah. Well, I haven't heard, I had never heard of a mulch fire. I've never heard of a compost fire. I've been asked this before, and I have to kind of just shut up on the issue because everybody has to figure out how to work with their local fire department. I would say that if your litter is like sort of fine enough, I find it hard to believe that they're going to call you on that. And, if you're not infiltrating water, you're creating basically a dead layer of fuel. So I would argue, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like we should have a Zoom conversation with the authorities that are implementing these rules. We should have a conversation together, because leaf litter is infiltrating the water, and that is making your soil more resilient. I have a really hard time with clearing everything and then creating an environment that is very friendly to non-native invasives like the brome grass and the fountain grass and the black mustard that jump up opportunistically and die back very fast and create a carpet, an accelerant. So I think if it's fine enough, if it's, if the leaf litter is broken down enough, I can't imagine they would say anything to you. I think they're more interested in those, that kind of loose layer of burnable material on top of it.
I can say from my own experience, I have left my leaf litter up, and I have always passed fire inspection.
Okay.
I do, just before the inspection, will pick up large leaves that are large and dry, and obviously the dust, I just leave it all, and I've never had a problem with that. Let's see. Melanie's asking, what kinds of native plants do you recommend for steep hillsides, ideally things that help with erosion control?
That is such a Glassell Park question. Glassell Park in Mount Washington, and so many hillsides. There are many, and there's a couple different ways I would go about it. And I you know, not to like try and get business, but you have to see it, because when you put new plants in any of these hillsides, getting them watered is a challenge. And so there's a couple different ways to go about it. I just did a big hillside in Glassell Park, and I put in all the perennials that I wanted to put in. And what I do is, I hope this isn't important. Here goes my kids' homework. So if this is your hillside, obviously you're going to get just very brutal runoff. It's really hard to get the water to go down in. So when I put a plant in, the first thing I'll do is say I'm going to put a toyon, you know, a 1 gallon toyon right here. I notch it out, make it flat. The plant goes into a little like soil ring. So here's I can make a little mound of soil, and then the stem goes up like that. And there's your little, you know, whatever, toyon. So this, can you see that? Is that making sense? So the water, when you water the toyon, it's going down like this. It's not immediately running downhill. It's going down like that. So that's the first thing I do. And then in terms of the plants themselves, and the reason I'm showing you that is because how you plant the plant matters as much as what you plant. But there are tons and tons of ground covers for the hills. And the most important thing to me is to make sure you know what your soil is, which up there it's usually clay and decomposed granite. And then what is it full sun, part sun? Is it, part shade? That has a huge impact on what I would recommend planting. Creeping snowberry, there's black sage cultivars that are ground covers. There's all kinds of buckwheat that are beautiful ground covers. There's actually many. There's creeping snowberry, which is a very local ground cover that likes shade, but it would depend on the amount of sun that the site gets. And then the other thing I do is once I get those in, because even, if you've got a big open hillside and you put those in, they're still only going to be about this big. They'll grow fast if they're happy. But then I get a hillside seed mix, and I will find the one that's appropriate to that area. It's usually like nodding needlegrass, California poppy, and a bunch of other ones. And I spread that everywhere. And I let those seeds, and I give them a good amount of water throughout that first season. And they'll just all jump up, and they'll lay in their nice shallow root system, and they'll just start to secure the whole area while you're in perennial ground covers need a little more time to root. So I do two things. I think of perennial ground covers that are going to work. I research those. I would go to calscape.org and enter your site, enter your orientation to the sun. Calscape.org, and then enter, and you can do a fine-tuned search, and you can say you want ground covers in a full sun hillside or a slope. It'll do erosion. It'll actually give you a list of plants. Again, anybody wants to follow up with me, like I'll totally help problem solve what you're trying to do.
Great.
And ever since someone posted elderberry regarding edibles, I have a whole list of things you can eat. But almost all of those are available at like Theodore Payne, Artemisia, some right down the hill of Plant Material, which I know can be a little spendy, but they're a great local resource. And Matt Burrows, who runs Plant Material down the hill there, he'll help you find plants if he doesn't have them.
Great. And we have one last question that I think is great for wrapping things up here. This is from Nate. How would you outline the process of moving from your before to your after? How to begin and what are the steps?
Start small. Identify a single space that you're interested in. the easiest thing to do is, I think, if you can find a small full sun spot and go to calscape.org, identify plants that are endemic to those conditions where you live. I really recommend using straight local species. You'll have the greatest likelihood of success. They're from here, they know how to put up with all this. And unless your soil is what was the other part of the question? Beginning to end, what was the,
It was just like, what was, yeah, how do you begin? What are the steps? So you,
yeah, you know, it's really, my steps were, I didn't have any grass or anything. So I put, you know, I just found the plants I wanted to go and just got started. I did as much research as I could. I went around and I talked to people. I'm actually working on an app that'll help people with this, because the big thing is to talk to people in your area. Find people in your area who are doing this and who are down the road a little bit, because that will help, that will clue you in to plants that are successful for your region and for your orientation to the sun. And I would honestly say, like, pick a small spot and think about, you know, like one big, one high and one low, you know, and get a couple of those and sort of concert to each other and see how they do. Take good care of them and see what they do. You'll learn from that. It's a hard thing for me to answer like in a really pat way, because it's so situational. And again, like, I show up at people's houses and I walk them through. Once I see their site, it's far easier for me to answer that question. And that my site has inspiration, education, implementation. So it is also designed to help take you through the process and give you resources if you want to check that out.
great. And Abby also put in a resource below LA Native Plant Source in Highland Park. So that's
Where are
another
they?
place to check out.
Oh,
All right.
that's cool. It's good to know about. I don't know them. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, David. I really
Yeah, thank you.
you